Hi there, this is Clifford Bates, and welcome again to our next session of readings Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. Last session, we dealt with the end of the first winter of the first year. Now we're going to be starting in the summer of the second year, in chapter 47. Um, um, it starts, right? Chapter 47 starts with this. Such was the funeral that took place during the winter, and which was the first year that it came to end. The first day of the summer, the Spartans and allies, with two-thirds of their forces, as before, invaded Attica under the commands of Archidamus, son of Zeuxidamus, a king of Sparta, and established themselves and laid waste to the country. In other words, the Attic countryside. Not many days after their arrival in Attica, a plague began to show itself among the Athenians. It was said that it broke out in many places previously in the neighborhood of Lemnosus and elsewhere, but a pestilence of such extent and mortality was nowhere remembered. Neither were the physicians at first and of any service, ignorant of what they were of the proper way to treat it, but they died themselves as most thickly, and they visited the sick as most often, nor did any human art succeed any better. Supplications in the temples, divinations, and the forth were found equally futile, till the overwhelming nature of the disaster at last put to a stop to them altogether. 48. It first began, as it is said, as part of in the parts of Ethiopia above Egypt, and whence descended into Egypt and Libya and to the most part of the king's country. Suddenly falling upon Athens, it first attacked the population, the Piraeus, which was on their occasion of saying that the Peloponnesians had poisoned the reservoirs, there being as yet no well there, and afterwards appeared in the upper city when the deaths became more frequent. All speculation as to the origins and the causes, if causes can be found adequate to produce such a great disturbance, I leave to other writers, whether lay or professional. For myself, I shall simply set down its nature and explain the symptoms by which perhaps it may be recognized by the student. It may should ever break out again. Thus, I can the better do it as I had the disease myself and watched its operation in the case of others. In other words, this is he was hit with it and was survived it. Chapter 49. That year, when it is agreed that to have been otherwise unprecedentedly free from sickness, and few cases occurred, all turned to this. As a rule, however, there was no ostensible cause, but people in good health all of a sudden attacked by violent heats in the head and redness and inflammation in their eyes. And the inward parts, such as the throat or tongues, became bloody and admitted an unnatural and fetid breath. These symptoms were followed by sneezing and hoarseness, after which the pain reached the chest and produced a hard cough. When it fixed in the stomach, it upset it and discharged the bile of every kind named by the physicians ensued, accompanied by a great distress. In most cases, also an ineffectual erection followed, produced violent spasms, in some cases ceased soon after, and others much later. Externally, the body was not very hot to touch, nor pale in appearance, but reddish, livid, and breaking out into small pustules and ulcers. But internally, it burned so to the point that the patient could not bear to have on him clothing or linen, even the lightest description, or indeed to be otherwise than stark naked. What they would have best like would have been to throw themselves in cold water, and indeed was done by some of the neglected sick who plunged into the rain tanks of their agonies of unquenched thirst, though it made no difference whether they drank little or much. Besides this, the miserable feeling of not being able to rest or sleep never ceased to torment them. The bodies, meanwhile, did not waste along so long as the distemper at its height, but held out to a marvel against its ravages. So, so that when they succumbed, as in most cases, on the seventh or eighth day, to the internal inflammation, they had some strength in them. But if they passed this stage, and the disease descended further into the bowels, inducing a violent ulceration, there accompanied by severe diarrhea. This brought on a weakness which was generally fatal. For the disorder first settled in the head, it ran course from hence to the whole body, and even where it did not prove mortal, it still left marks on the extremities. For it settled in the privy parts, the fingers and the toes, and many escaped with the loss of these, some too with that of the eyes. Others again were seized with an entire loss of memory on their first recovery and did not know either themselves or their friends. Now, 50. But while the nature of the distempers was such as to baffle all description, and its attack almost too grievous for human nature to endure, it was still in the following circumstances its a difference from ordinary disorders was most clearly shown. All the birds and the beasts that prey upon human bodies either abstained from touching them, though they were many lying unburied, or dead after tasting them. In proof of this, it was noticed that birds of this kind actually disappeared. They were not about the bodies, or indeed to be seen at all. But of course, the effect which I have mentioned could be studied in the domestic animal like a dog. In other words, it could be studied in the domestic animal like a dog. Since such, then, if we pass over the varieties of particular courses, which may particular, which were many in particular, and the general features of the December. Meanwhile, the city enjoyed an immunity from the ordinary disorders. For I'll repeat. Okay. Meanwhile, the city enjoyed immunity from all the ordinary disorders, or if any case incurred, it ended in this: some died in neglect, others in the midst of every attention. No remedy was found that could be used on a specific, for what did good in one case did harm in another. Strong and weak constitutions proved equally incapable of resistance, all alike being swept away. Although dieted with the utmost precautions, in other words, even the strong way, it affected everyone. The strong constitution, weak constitution, how much, although dieted with the utmost precaution. By far, the most terrible feature in the malignity was the dejection which ensued when anyone felt himself sickening, for the despair into which they instantly fell took away their power of resistance, and left them much easier prey to the disorder. Besides which, there was an awful spectacle of men dying like sheep, though having caught the infection and nursing each other. This caused the greatest mortality. On the one hand, if they were afraid to visit each other, they perished from neglect. Indeed, many houses were emptied of their inmates for want of a nurse. On the other, if they ventured to do so, death was the consequence. This was especially the case as such as made any pretensions to goodness. Honor made them unsparingly to themselves in the attendance of their friends' houses. where even members of the family were the last worn out by the moans of the dying and succumbed to the force of this disaster. Yet it was with those who had recovered from the disease that the sick and the dying found most compassion. These knew that it was from experience and had now no fear for themselves. For the same man was never attacked twice, never at least fatally. And the person not only received the congratulations of others, but themselves also, in elation of the moment, half entertained in the vain hope that they were for the future safe from disease whatsoever. The aggravation of the existing calamity on the influx from the country into the city, and this was especially felt by the new arrivals. As there were no houses to receive them, they had to be lodged in the hot season of the year in stuffling cabins, where the mortality raged without restraint. The bodies of dying men laid upon another, half dead creatures reeled about the streets and gathered round all the fountains in their longing for water. The sacred places also in which they had quartered themselves were filled with corpses of persons that died there. There, as they were, for the disaster passed all bounds, men, not knowing what had become of them, became utterly careless for everything, whether sacred or profane. All the burial rites before in use were entirely upset, and they buried the bodies as best they could. Many, from want of popular appliances, thought so many of their friends be having dead already, have recourse to the most shameless mode of burial, sometimes getting in first before those who raised the pile. They threw their own dead body upon the stranger's pile and ignited it. Sometimes they tossed the corpse which they were carrying off the top of another that was burning and went off. Nor was the only form of lawless extravagance which owed its origins to the plague. Now, men now did just what they pleased, coolly venturing on what they had formerly done only in a corner, seeing the rapid transition produced by persons in prosperity suddenly dying, those who before had nothing succeeding to their property. So they resolved to spend quickly and enjoy themselves, regarding their lives and their riches like a thing, like things of a day. Perseverance in what men call honor was popular with none. It was so uncertain whether they could be spared to obtain the object, but it was settled that present enjoyment and all that contribute to it both was both honorable and useful. Fear of gods or law of man, there was none to restrain them. For as for the first, they judged it to be just the same whether they worshipped them or not, as they saw all alike perishing. And for the last, no one expected to live to be brought to trial for his offense, but each felt that a fair, severer sentence had been already passed on them and hung over their heads, and before this fell, it was only reasonable to enjoy a little life, to enjoy life a little. That's 53. Now we're going to turn to 54. Chapter 54. Such was the nature of the calamity, and heavily it weighed on the Athenians, death raging within the city and devastating without. Among other things which they remembered in this distress, very naturally, the following verse, which the old men said had been long ago uttered. Um, um, this again, this is a part of that. A Dorian war shall come, and with it pestilence. A Dorian war shall come, and with it pestilence. So, therefore, the war will come, and then pestilence will come. So, a dispute arose as to whether death and not death had not been the word of the verse. But at the present juncture, it was, of course, decided in favor of the latter, for the people made their reconciliation fit in with their suffering. I supposed, however, that if another Dorian war should ever afford or came upon us, and a famine should happen to accompany it, the verse will probably be readily read accordingly. The oracle also, which had been given to the Spartans, was now remembered by those who knew it. When the god was asked whether they should go to war, he answered that they should put their might into it, victory would be theirs, and that he himself would be with them. When this oracle with this oracle events were supposed to tally. In other words, the events were to tally with this oracle, but the events were supposed to tally. For the plague broke out as soon as the Peloponnesians invaded Attica, and never entering the Peloponnesians, not even the least extent worth noticing, committed its worst ravages on Athens and next to Athens, as the population of other cities, at the most populous of other cities, such as the history of the plague. In other words, this is the history of the plague. After ravaging the plains of the Peloponnese, advanced into the Parlian region as far as Litharium, where the Athenian silver mines are. First laid waste the side looking towards the Peloponnese. Next, that which faces Ubla and Endos. But Pericles, who was still general, held the same opinion as in the former invasion, and would not Athenians march against them. So this is what the Spartans were there, and they were out in force, causing havoc, right? But, but Pericles said, "Don't go out there and fight them." However, while they were still in the plain and yet had not entered the Pelusian land, he had prepared an armament of 100 ships for the Peloponnese. And when all was ready to put out to sea, on board the ship he took 4,000 Athenian heavy infantry and 300 cavalry and horse transports, and then for the first time made out of old Trimenes 50 Charian and Lesbian vessels also joining in expedition. When this Athenian armament put out to sea, they left the Peloponnesian Attica in the Parlian region. Arriving at Epidaurus, Epidaurus in the Peloponnese, they ravaged most of the territory and even had hopes of taking the city on the assault. In this, they had not succeeded. Putting out from Epidaurus, they laid waste the territories of Terozin, Helethys, Hieronyme, all the cities on the coast of the Peloponnesus, and thence sailing to Pares, a maritime city in Laconia, ravaged part of its territories and took and sacked the place itself. After which they returned home, but found the Peloponnesians gone and no longer in Attica. 56. During the whole time that the Peloponnese were at Attica and the Athenians on the expedition on their ships, men kept dying of both the plague, both in the armaments and in Athens. Indeed, it was actually asserted that the departure from the Peloponnese was hastened by fear of the disorder, as they heard from deserters that it was in the city, and also could be seen the burials going on. Yet in this invasion, they remained longer than in others, and ravaged the whole country. For they were about 40 days, for they were about 40 days in Attica. The same summer, Haragon, the son of Nicias, and Claropompus, son of Clinaeus, the colleagues of Pericles, took the armament of which he had lately made use, and went up on the expedition against the Caledonians in the Thracian region, and against Potidæa, which was still under siege. As soon as they arrived, they brought up their siege engines against Potidæa and tried every means of taking it, but did not succeed either in capturing the city or in doing anything else worth of their preparations. The plague attacked them here also and committed such havoc as to cripple them completely, even in previous healthy soldiers of the former expedition catching the infection from Hagon's troops. While Promenoi and the 1,600 men whom he committed only escaped by being no longer in the neighborhood of the Caledonians. The end of it when the Hagon returned with his ships to Athens, having lost 1,050 out of 4,000 hoplites in 40 days, though the soldiers stationed there before remained in the country and carried the siege of Patadea. Um, Now, this is 59. After the second invasion of the Peloponnese, a change came over the spirit of the Athenians. Their land had now been twice laid, and the war and pestilence at once pressed heavy on them. They began to find fault with Pericles as the author of the war and the cause of their misfortune, and began eager to come to terms with Sparta. Actually, sent ambassadors thither, whom did not, however, succeed in their mission. Their despair was now complete and vented itself upon Pericles. When he saw them exasperated at the present turn of affairs and acting exactly as he had anticipated, he called on an assembly, it being remembered still general, with the double object of restoring confidence and of leading them away from these angry feelings to calmer and still hopeful state of mind. He accordingly came forward and spoke the following. Now, this is the next speech, Pericles. This is at 60. I am not. I am not unprepared for the indignation to which I have been the object, and I know its cause. And I have called an assembly of the purpose of reminding you of certain points and protesting against your being unreasonably irritated against me or cowed by your suffering. I'm of the opinion that our Athens' greatness is more to the advantage of private citizens than any individual well-being coupled with public humiliation. A man may be. Oh God, this is a speech that someone should have given during at the beginning of COVID, right? Um, Someone should have, if someone was read and not, you know, the uneducated buffoon. Okay, I'm gonna say trouble. The relatively uneducated person he is in terms of these things. This is where Pericles would have helped someone, to understand this. Um, he goes, cowed by your suffering. I'm of the opinion that the national greatness or the greatness of Athens is more to the advantage of private citizens than the individual well-being coupled with public humiliation. A man may be personally ever so well off, and yet if his country be ruined, he must be ruined with it. Whereas a flourishing commonwealth always affords chances of salvation for the unfortunate individual. Since then, a city can support the misfortunes of private citizens, while they cannot support hers. It is surely the duty of everyone to be forward in her defense, and not like you to be so confounded with your domestic afflictions as to give up all thoughts of the common safety, and blame me for having counseled war and you yourselves for having voted for it. And yet, if you are angry at me, it is it is with one who, as I believe, is second to no man in knowing of the proper policy or the ability to expound it, and who is moreover not only a patriot but an honest one, a man possessing that knowledge without the faculty of exposition might as well have no idea at all on the matter. If he had both these gifts, but no love of his country, he would be a cold advocate for her interest. While his patriotism not proof against bribery, everything else would go for a price. So that if you thought, that I was even moderately distinguished for these qualities when you took my advice and went to war, then certain it is there is certainly no reason why I should be charged with having done wrong. For those courses who have a free choice in the matter, and whose fortunes have not a stake, the war is the greatest follies. But if the only choice was between submission with loss of independence and danger with the hope of preserving their independence. In such a case, it is he who will not accept the risk that deserves the blame, not he who will. I am the same man and do not alter. It is you who change. Since I, in fact, took my advice while unhurt and waited of misfortune to repent it, and the apparent error of my policy lies in the infirmity of your resolution, since the suffering that it entails is being felt by everyone among you, while its advantage is still remote and obscured but to all, and a great and sudden reverse having fallen on you, your mind is too much depressed to persevere in your resolve. So, before what is sudden, unexpected, and least within calculation, the spirit quails, and putting all else aside, the plague has certainly been an emergency of this kind. Born, however, as you are, citizens of a great city, and brought up as you have been with habits equal to your birth, you should be ready to face the greatest disasters and still kept unprepared the luster of your name, to keep unimpaired the luster of your name, of your city, for the judgment of mankind in its relentlessness to the weakness that falls short of a recognized renown, and it is jealous of the arrogance that aspires higher than its due. Cease then to grieve of your private affections, and advise yourselves instead of the safety of the common, of the community, the koinonia, the political community. If you shrink before the exertions which the war makes necessary, and fear that after all they may not have a happy result, you know the reasons by which I have often demonstrated to you the groundlessness of your apprehension. If those aren't enough, I will now reveal an advantage arising from the greatness of your dominion, which I think has never yet been suggested itself to you, which I never mentioned in my previous speeches, and which has been so bold that I should scarce adventure it now, were it not for the unnatural depression where I see around me. You perhaps think that your empire extends only over your allies. I will declare to you the truth. The visible field of action has two parts, land and sea, and the whole of one of those who of these you are completely supreme, not only as far as you use it at present, but also to what further extent you may think fit in future. Your naval resources are such that your vessels may go where they please, without the kings or any other nation on earth being able to stop them. So that although you may think it's a great privation to lose your use of your land and your houses, still you must see that this power is something widely different. And indeed, on fretting on their account, you should really regard them in light of the gardens, in the light of the gardens, and other accessories that embellish a great fortune, and as in comparison of moment little moment. Yes, you you should know too that liberty preserved by your efforts will easily recover from for us what we have lost, while the knee once bowed, even what you have will pass from you. In other words, if we, as long as we're free and if we are successful, we'll basically recover this. But once we submit, even everything we have will be lost. Okay, this is the end of that sense. We'll pass everything. What you have will pass from you. Your fathers received these possessions not from others, but from themselves. Did not let slip that their labors had acquired, but delivered them safely to you. In this respect, at least, you must prove yourselves their equal, remembering that you lose what one has got more disgracefully than be thwarted in getting. You must confront your enemies not merely with spirit but disdain. Confidence can indeed, uh, confidence can indeed a blissful. Yeah, okay. Confidence can indeed a blissful ignorance impart. I would say differently. That's a weird structure. Confidence can impart a blissful ignorance, right? Even a coward's breast, but disdain is the privilege of those who, like us, have been assured by reflection of their superiority to the adversary. And where the chances are the same, knowledge fortifies courage by the contempt which it is consequence. It's trust being placed not in hope, which is the prop of the desperate, but in a judgment grounded on existing resources, whose anticipations are more to be depended upon. So he's not saying, he says, don't have your confidence on hope. Have your confidence on knowledge of our resources. In other words, he has a very powerful argument here, saying we're not, our resources are still there. We have all these resources, all this stuff. Yes, we're suffering, and yes, some people are having their things, but our power and our thing is here. And you want us to, this is, don't, it's not about my confidence is not based upon hope, because that's a poor, cheap confidence, but rather on the resources and assets we have. Okay. 63. Again, your country has a right to your services in sustaining the glories of her position. These are these are a common source of pride to you all, and you cannot decline the burdens of empire and expect to share its honors. You should remember also that when you are frightened against what you are frightened against is not merely slavery in exchange for independence, but also the loss of empire and the dangers of animosities incurred in the exercise. Besides, to reconcile besides to recede is no longer possible. If indeed any of you in the alarm of the moment have become enamored of the honesty of such an unambitious part, what you what you hold is, to speak somewhat plainly, a tyranny. To take it perhaps was wrong, but to let it go is unsafe. And men of these retiring views, making converts of others, would quickly ruin a city. Indeed, the result would be the same if they could live independently by themselves. For retiring and unambitious, they are never secure without vigorous protectors at their side. And indeed, such qualities are useless to an imperial city, although they may help a dependency to an unmolested servitude. Uh, that's a powerful speech in that sense. But you must not be seduced by citizens like these, nor be angry with me, for if I voted for war, only did as you did yourselves, in spite of the enemy having invaded your country, and done what you could be certain that he would do if you had refused to comply with his demands. And in addition to what we expected, the plague has come upon us, the only point, indeed, at which our calculation had been at fault. In other words, the plague hit us, and this is the thing. My calculation, didn't get perceived. This is going to happen. So this is the thing that my okay, all right. He says that all the other things, everything came out to be expected. The only thing that differently was the plague. And it is this that I know that had a large share in making me more unpopular than I otherwise have been, quite undeservedly, unless you are also prepared to give me the credit of any successes which the chance may present you. Besides, the hand of heaven must now borne with resignation, that of the enemy with fortitude. This was the old way of Athens, and do not and do and do not you prevent it from being so still. Remember, too, that if your country has the greatest name in all the world, it is because she never bent before disaster, because she had expended more life and effort in war than any other city, and had won for herself a power greater than any hitherto known, the memory of which will descend to the latest posterity. Even if now, in obedience to the general law of decay, we should ever be forced to yield, still it will be remembered that when we held rule over the Hellenes than any other Hellenic city, that we sustained the greatest war against their unified or separate powers, and inhabited a city unrivaled by any others in resources and magnitude. These glories may incur the censure of the slow and unambitious, but in the breasts of the energetic, they will make awake emotions, emulations, or awake emulations, and in those who must remain without them, envious regret. Hatred and unpopularity at a moment have fallen to the lot of all who have aspired to rule, others. But where hatred must be incurred, true wisdom incurs it for the highest objects. In other words, if you're going to get hated, you might as well get hated for the higher things. In other words, you know, if you're going to be, this idea he's saying, we're going to be, anyone who strives for greatness or domination or power over others, um, it's going to create envy. You're doing better than someone else. You're doing something else. They're going to envy it. They're going to be envious of you, and therefore they're going to eventually come to dislike you or hate you. And therefore, if you're going to be hated, you better be hated because you've done these higher things, not these lower things, right? Um, uh, Hatred is also short lived, but that which makes the splendor of the present and the glory of the future remains forever unforgiven. In other words, hatred is forgiven, but that which makes the splendor of the present and the glory of the future remains forgotten, is not forgiven, unforgotten. You made great things. The present, this, you produced great effect, great things. This will be remembered. Make your decision, therefore, for glory then, and honor now, and abstain both objects by instant and zealous efforts. Do not send heralds to Sparta. Do not betray any sign of being oppressed by your present suffering, since they whose mind are least sensitive to calamity, and whose hands are most quick to meet it, are the men in the greatest community. In other words, the greatest people, the greatest men, are those who don't shirk from present problems and but those whose minds are least sensitive to the crisis of calamity and most quick to meet to confront dangers. These are the greatest people in communities. Such were the argument of Pericles tried to cure the Athenians of their anger against him and to divert their thoughts from their immediate affections. As the community, he succeeded in convincing them. They not only gave up the ideas of sending to Sparta, but applied themselves with increasing energy to the war. Still, as private individuals, they could not help smarting under their suffering. The common people, having been deprived of the little that they ever possessed, while the higher orders had lost fine properties with costly establishments and buildings in the country. The worst of all, the war, and worst of all, had war instead of peace. In fact, the public feeling against him did not subside until he had been fined. Not long afterwards, however, according to the ways of the multitude, they again elected him general and committed all their affairs to his hands, having now become less sensitive to their private and domestic afflictions, and understanding that he was the best man for all their needs of the city. For as long as he was the head of the city during the peace, he pursued a moderate and conservative policy, and his time, its greatness was at its height, and in his time, its greatness was at its height. When the war broke out here, he also seemed to have rightly gauged the power of the country, the Athens. He outlived its commencement 2 years and 6 months, and the correctness of his foresight concerning the war became better known after his death. He told them to wait quietly, to pay attention to their navy, their marine, and no attempts to conquest, and to expose the city to no hazard during the war. In doing this, promised them a favorable result. What they did was the very contrary, allowing private ambitions and private interest in matters apparent quite foreign to the war to lead them into projects both unjust to themselves and to their allies. Projects whose success would only conduce to the honors and advantage of private persons, and whose failures entailed certain disaster to the country and the war. The causes of this are not far to seek. Pericles, indeed, by his rank, ability, and known integrity, was entitled to a certain was enabled to exercise a certain independent control over the multitude. In short, he led them instead by being led by them. In other words, in short, he to lead them instead of being led by them. In other words, this is the case of the demagogue, popular leader. There's two types: those who lead the people, who are their people's supporters, and then tries to lead them, and those who simply follow them. Okay, who do what they or and merely flatter them. Okay, and also, and, that's right. The idea of flattery, we understand this is this, leading them versus following them. Okay. This is an interesting. This is what lead them instead of be led by them. For as he never sought power by improper means, but B was ever compelled to B was ever no it's he I'm sorry, this is a bad scan. He was never compelled to flatter them, but on the contrary, enjoyed so high an estimation that he could afford to anger them by contradiction. Whenever he saw them unseasonably and irresolvably elated, he would have a word. He with a word reduced to alarm. On the other, if they fell victim to a panic, he could at once restore them to confidence. In short, what was normally a democracy had become in his hands government by the first citizen. With his successor, it was different, more on a level with one another, and each grasping at supremacy. They ended by committing even the conduct of state affairs, city affairs of the city, to the whims of the multitude. In other words, while he led the city, they submitted to the city's decision, people's decision. Okay, um, with his successor. In other words, number 11, this, as might have been expected in a great sovereign city, however, produced a host of blunders, among them the Sicilian exposition. Though this failed, not so much through a miscalculation of power of those against whom it was sent, as though a fault in the sender in not taking the best measures against afterwards to assist those who had gone out, but choosing rather to occupy themselves with private squabbles for the leadership of the people, by which they not only paralyzed operations in the field, but also introduced civil discord at home. Yet, after losing most of their fleet beside other forces in Sicily, and with the factions already dominant in the city, they could still, for 3 years, make heads against their original adversaries, joined not only by the Sicilians, but by their own allies, nearly all in revolt, and at last by the king's son Cyrus, who furnished funds for the Peloponnesian navy. Nor did they finally succumb till they fell victims of their own intestine disorders. So excessively abundant were the resources from which the genius of Pericles foresaw an easy triumph of the war, were unaided over the unaided forces of the Peloponnesians. Um, Now 66. During the same summer, Spartan allies made an independent expedition of 100 ships against Zaccharinus, an island off the coast of Ella, peopled by a colony of Archaeans from the Peloponnese, in alliance with Athens. They were 1,000 hoplites on board, and Camillus, a Spartan admiral. They made a descent from their ships and ravaged the country, but the inhabitants would not submit. They sailed back home. 67. At the end of the same summer, the Corinthian Artinus, with an envoys from Sparta, Orestes, Nicholas, and Podemus, and Temos from Terra, and a private individual named Polius from Argos, came to Scythicus, son of Terras, king of Thrace, on the way to Asia to persuade the king to supply funds and join in the war. They hoped to induce Terras, if possible, to forsake the alliance of Athens and march on Pardea, when then besieged by the Athenian force. They hoped to persuade Terras to convey them across the Hellespont to Panapolis, upon who was to send them up country to the king. But there chanced to be with Sitalus some Athenian ambassadors, Lycurgus, son of Callimachus, and Aristaemus, son of Philippon, and who persuaded Sitalus' son Sadocus, the new Athenian citizen, to put the men into their hands, and thus prevented them from crossing over to the king and doing their part to injure his city. He accordingly had them seized as they were traveling through Thrace to a vessel in which they were to cross over the Hellespont by a party who had sent on the Lycurgus and Medanus, and gave orders for the delivery to the Athenian ambassador, by whom they were brought to Athens. On the arrival, the Athenians, afraid that Aristus, who had been notable, the prime mover in previous affairs at Padea and Thracian possession, might live to do them more mischief still if he escaped, slew them all on the same day, without giving them a trial or hearing the defense which they offered. And cast their bodies into a pit, thinking themselves justified in using in retaliation the same mode of warfare the Spartans had begun, when they slew and cast into pits all the Athenians and allied traders whom they caught on board the merchantmen around the Peloponnesus. Indeed, at the outset of the war, Spartans butchered as enemies all who they took on sea, or whether allies of Athens or neutrals. So, 68, about the same time as the close of the summer, Ansabat forces, with the number of barbarians they had raised, marched against Anthrophilian Argos and the rest of the country. The origins of their enmity against the Argives was this: Argos and the rest of the Amphiliochi were colonized by Amphilius' son Amphicheiros. Dissatisfied with the state of affairs at home on his return after the Trojan War, he built this city in Ambracian Gulf and named it Argos after his own country. This was the largest city in Amphilochia, and its inhabitants the most powerful. Under the pressure of misfortune, many generations afterward had called in the Ambraciots, their neighbors on the Amphictyonian border, to join their colony. And it was by this union with the Ambraciots that they learned the present Hellenistic speech. The rest of the Amphilasians being barbarians. After a time, the Ambraciots expelled the Argives and held the city for themselves. Upon this, the Amphiphilians gave themselves over to Oncardians, and the two together called the Athenians, who sent them Parmos, a general, and 30 ships. Upon this, they took Argos by storm and made slaves of the Ambraciots, and the Amphilians, Argives, and the Anchilians inhabited the city in common. After this began the alliance between Athens and the Arcanians. The enmity of the Amiots against the Argives thus commenced with the enslavement of their citizens, and afterwards, during the war, the Ensarbots collected the armaments among themselves and the Chileans and others of the neighboring barbarians. Arrived before Argos, arrived before Argos, they became masters of the country, but not being successful on their attack on the city. Returned home, dispensed among their different people. Um, uh, uh, now, I'm going to end here. This is, and such were the events of the summer, and he says now this is going to go through winter. So we end the summer of the second year. Okay, if you have any comments, please give the comments below. If I see them and respond to them, I respond to them. If you have any, questions or concerns about things, again, put them below and I'll respond. If you like what we did here, like it. If you didn't like it, you can come down to. I'm not, be honest. Put your criticisms. If you have criticisms, put them on there. If you liked it and share it with a friend, share on social media. If you want to subscribe, and you get more notices of this. If you want to follow me on social media, my information is below. If you want to help me out so I can do more of these things and spend more time doing these things and actually find ways of increasing things, go to my subscribe star below. Again, I need help. I'm interested in doing other things, like people said, like, oh, you're going to have host or roundtables and things like this. I have some means to do some things, electronically. I have Zoom and a large Zoom capacity and things like this. I've done this, and okay, I'm willing, but I need and I even have a Discord server, but I don't have it open really yet, and I'm afraid of it in that sense. I'm not into Discord. I never did this. I joined it up because someone I know, on one of the YouTubers who did biology, the infamous JF. I knew him before he became a YouTuber. I knew him because of common friends at Duke in the evolutionary science people. I had friends who were evolutionary science and Duke, and they mentioned him to me. That and I saw some of his videos before and things, and it was interesting, and I saw him come to fame. We corresponded. And I loved very much his book on the evolution. It's a very good book. In fact, maybe I should talk about it. So maybe I should talk with a little bit of evolution in that sense. And my own background was from that stuff in political science. So that's how I joined his Discord server, and I was kind of run off. I didn't like it. I don't, not because of him. It's because the nature of Discord. It's not really it leads to kind of bad behavior. Now I'm talking about this, so I shouldn't. So again, I hope you all have a good day. Take care, and see you soon.